Okay, so the topic for this morning is new ways of working, returning to the workplace, engaging around key challenges, and goodness knows in terms of the pandemic, we've become quite adept at engaging with challenges. I would like to think we've become adept in determining in how to overcome them. And then we also always are looking out for the trends in terms of the workplace generally. And there are a number of emerging trends that we're going to touch on. Our agenda for the session this morning is fairly packed. We're essentially going to spend a bit of time on this development around remote working. In particular, the right to request remote working. And I'd like to work through some of the, questions that people have raised, I have raised, colleagues have raised since the pandemic, essentially overnight, provoked many workers into a remote working arrangement. And I suppose with the benefit of having endured that overnight scenario, the government and trade unions and indeed employer representatives have had a bit of time to collaborate and to think about going forward in the world of work with remote working. What should that look like and what kind of parameters should there be on it? So I think that's a big one for any scale of employer as we move into 2022. And I suppose with that then comes, or is there a requirement to think about the new tools that we need in relation to managing what is a flexible or a hybrid working arrangement? With everything, there are pluses and minuses. So there are some, I suppose, things that we need to think about differently in terms of a remote workforce or a hybrid workforce that we didn't have to contemplate when people were fully present in the physical environment. But obviously there are some upsides that I'd like to share with you as well. We want to look at the requirements around employers to prepare for remote working. So the need that has been clearly advocated that you would have a policy that is addressing the issues that have arisen in the context of remote working and this right to request it. So that'll be an important takeaway, that people would feel that they had the tools to generate their hybrid, remote or flexible work policy. I'd like to touch on also the transitional return to work protocol. This is since the 24th of January, where the government have obviously put down the parameters in terms of what's required by employers and employees when people are returning to the physical or traditional workplace. And obviously that requires us to think, and we should be thinking it always, but also to think in relation to the return to a traditional workplace, perhaps where somebody has not been in it for nearly 18, 19 months. We need to think about how we're addressing employee well-being. And then to tail it, there are a number of developments that are imminent in relation to employment law provisions that will be applicable to all employers in some shape, make or form. Some of it is contingent in terms of the size of the organisation, but I'll address that when we get to it. Okay. So we are a partner with Fingal Chamber, and the service that Adare provide is that essentially people come to us in relation to managing their industrial relations, their human resource management and their employment law issues. And when we partner with entities, we provide a range of supports for them that essentially underpin those three areas. But in terms of the detail, we would be assisting people around the contracts of employment, employee handbooks, obviously keeping you in the know in terms of emergent employment law and other, indeed, employment-related developments. And then when things spill out of the internal policy and process, when perhaps employees elect to make a complaint to the Workplace Relations Commission, and then if the matter goes forward to the Labour Court, we would represent clients in that capacity. Briefly then, that essentially is marking the activities that we provide. And as you can see, we work across many sectors. So, and your President, John, touched on the range of activities that are happening in the Fingal Chamber District. And you can see that we are very much working across supporting businesses that would be very typical in your own chamber. Very briefly, in terms of myself, my background is that I suppose my first professional role, I did work in what was known as personnel management at the time. And my interest in it provoked me into studying in the King's Inns, and I obviously was particularly interested in employment law, and I practiced for many years as an employment law barrister, and subsequently I provided advices to a range of private, not-for-profit and public sector organisations. And I've been working with Adare for the last couple of years, providing that type of expertise. Okay, so let's get into the issue. And the first thing that is on everybody's agenda in terms of whether you are an employer, and probably particularly if you are an employer, but also on very much on the minds of employees, those who have come back to work, those who are contemplating coming back to work. So we have a bill at the moment, and as of the 25th of January, there's a general scheme of this bill that has been published, and you can look at it on gov.ie, but in essence, it is, if you like, setting out what is contemplated to be contained in the ultimate act around this right to request remote working. It's envisaged, as with many employment law rights, that there will be a code of practice that will be developed by the Workplace Relations Commission, which will provide, helpfully, we hope, employers and indeed employees with guidance on managing remote working requests. Now, if you looked at the schedule of legislative work that the government is contemplating for this term, it is quite enormous. In any event, they have indicated that they expect that this bill will be ready by the summertime. So there is a bit of time in ease of that for employer organisations to be getting as ready as they can be, knowing what I'm going to tell you is contemplated in the bill. So the first thing that we need to think about in relation to remote working is somebody applying for it. And as the bill, and remember it's a bill, not an act we're talking about, but as the bill is indicating, any employee with 6 months service can ask their employer if they can work remotely. And employers are going to have to generate, and as I said, make available to their workforce a remote working policy. And it's contemplated that this remote working policy will be subject to being inspected by the WRC. The time frame that the bill contemplates between when an employee asks about remote working and them getting a response in accordance, obviously, with the policy is indicated to be 12 weeks. And it is envisaged that there would be some form of discussion arising between the applicant and their employer. The bill, again, is contemplating that the employer can propose different arrangements to what the employee is asking for, and that the employee has 1 month to accept or reject these alternative proposals that their employer has made. And if they do reject it, again, the bill is stating that the employee must give some reasons as to why they're objecting to that. In terms of the application, there are proposed, at least under the terms of the scheme of the bill, a number of things that the employee must do in terms of that particular application for remote working. So they must indicate in it where they are contemplating doing the work from, obviously the start date. If it is that they are looking to work for example, out of a 5-day week, that they're looking to work 3 days of that remotely, they would need to indicate that. They need to advise their employer, if it's appropriate down the road, that they've made a previous maybe application to work remotely and when that application was. And they need to also submit a self-assessment of the suitability of the location. And what that is really addressing is that, as we could, I suppose, appreciate, although maybe the law would not support it, when people had to vacate their workplaces overnight, many people spent some time thereafter maybe delivering work for their employer, sitting on the sofa, maybe on a bed. If they didn't have a desk, they didn't have the correct ergonomics, they didn't have the correct equipment, and clearly in terms of health and safety and welfare at work in the short, medium, and particularly long term, that is problematic. So the employee's application is going to have to cover off the health, safety, and welfare, as it were, and indeed the equipment and requirement aspects of taking my work out of the physical workspace and bringing it to a remote location, whether that is my home or indeed whether that is a hub or some other location that I am proposing. Now, remember, the bill is only about the right to request remote working. It isn't saying that there is a right to remote working. And I think that's important in terms of both parties to the application understanding. So the refusal of the request in terms of the scheme of the bill has been identified as potentially some of these reasons. So the nature of the work doesn't allow for the work to be done remotely. And we can all think of examples whereby it is absolutely contingent on the delivery of perhaps a service that an individual has to present themselves to a particular workspace. There may be an inability to reorganize work amongst your existing workforce. Maybe it's a very small workforce, and maybe there are people availing of other kinds of protective leaves at the time that the applicant is looking to work remotely. And so that might mean that you had nobody physically in the space as a consequence of that dynamic. Maybe you are able to objectively demonstrate that there would be a negative impact on the quality of the product or the service that you were providing if that application was to be granted. Maybe there's an impact on co-workers. Maybe there are additional costs that are going to accrue in respect of the employer's business. Maybe there are particular concerns that you have in relation to confidentiality, or there might be issues around intellectual property. And maybe you have concerns in the space that I touched on earlier, which is health and safety grounds. The bill contemplates that an application can be made once every 12 months. And the only caveat to that is it could be made more frequently than that if the individual applicant's role changed. Now, the scheme of the bill also sets out refusal of the request to remote working on business grounds. And this is contemplating issues like data protection, internet connectivity, the distance between the remote proposed location and the on-site location. If there was any conflicts, maybe around a collective agreement that is currently in situ, or there might be structural changes, or there might be something that was going on with that particular employee, or maybe you might have been in the space of working through a disciplinary process. So these are all factors that are real and tangible, and that they may, in the particular set of circumstances, be the basis on which the relevant employer entity refuses the application on business grounds. The scheme of the bill is not setting out exhaustive grounds, and we see this with other pieces of legislation. What it's trying to do is to be indicative in those grounds. And I suppose, remembering that it's a bill, but looking at it objectively, at this point, it would appear that the employer has full discretion to decline a request for remote working, so long as the refusal is grounded in objective assessment of business needs. So it can't just be theoretically, you might be exposed in terms of data protection or confidentiality, or theoretically you're concerned about health and safety and welfare and the well-being of the individual. You would need something more robust than that. It is also envisaged in the bill that the employer could consider the request as withdrawn where there is a 12-week period that has passed and there has been no further engagement by the applicant with the employer, or no seeking of any additional information or indeed meetings with their employer. So if it was the case that you get the application and you are calibrating whether this is something that you are prepared to do, and indeed that you have the capacity to do, if you are approving the application, then you must confirm the arrangement in writing. You should, in that confirmation, indicate and be clear about it. If this is for a trial period, if it is for a temporary period, or if you are saying it starts on the blank day of blank and it finishes on the blank day of blank, because that obviously gives clarity and consistency to the individuals involved, and it diminishes or mitigates the space in which there is going to be a disagreement. Oh, I understood that you were permitting me to work remotely indefinitely, and I've kind of set up my work-life balance around it. So you would also need to address in this approval, if it is an issue, any equipment that is to be provided by the employer entity, or if there were any costs payable by the employer to the employee, because maybe they are incurring additional outgoings as a consequence of remote working. It is important to highlight that, as with all recent employee legislation, the bill has the usual anti-penalization clauses. So what that means is that if somebody has asked for remote working and maybe they didn't get it, or indeed if they did get it, you couldn't construe your behavior against them in any pejorative way because they were somebody that was annoying you about remote working. The employee has a right to appeal your refusal to the Workplace Relations Commission, but only after they have exhausted an internal appeal around your refusal. And that has to be 2 weeks after that internal process has concluded. Now, this right to make a complaint to the WRC is only in relation to any failure that is alleged against the employer not being in sync procedurally with whatever this act will obligate an employer to do. Just to be clear, the right to make a complaint is not on the basis that I asked John, could I work remotely? And he said on a business objectively justified ground, no. That would not enable an employee to go to the WRC with a complaint. But if I didn't have my application dealt with in accordance with the provisions of what will be an act, then I could go to the WRC on the procedural impropriety of the employer. If I go to the WRC correctly, they can listen to my complaint and they can do one of the following. Say it was or wasn't well founded, direct the employer to provide reasons within 4 weeks, and or award up to 4 weeks remuneration. It's also important to point out that the draft scheme envisages that failure to have a policy in place that is brought to the attention of the employees of a particular workplace will be an offence. So this is a new thing that we're seeing in recent provisions of employment law. So that on a summary conviction, there'd be a Class C fine, and that would currently be in the realm of about €2,500. Now, look, that's not to say that when this bill is enacted, that the WRC are going to be sitting in the long grass waiting to fine employers. This is really, the last space that any sort of a conflict ends up in. But nonetheless, it's important for us to note that this facility is there. The Workplace Relations Commission inspectors, they can also issue fixed payment notices in relation to the failure of an entity to comply with the requirement to establish and maintain a remote working policy. So clearly we can see, even though we are looking at a bill at present, it is really important that employers would be prepared and ready to review that act when it is enacted, in terms of having the bones of a remote working policy in place. So the draft scheme of the bill requires employers to retain the records in relation to remote working for 3 years. And obviously there is a fine in relation to the non-retention of records. And this is a very common thing that we see in respect of employee rights generally. So in terms of remote working and your to-do list, you need to generate a remote working policy. Or if you had one in operation or have one in operation as a consequence of COVID, it would be advisable to review that policy now and not necessarily assume that the one that you had is going to be compliant with what I've set out as the contents of the bill. You need to ensure that the return to work policy is provided to new employees together with the statement of the terms and conditions documentations, and that their attention is drawn generally within the workforce to this remote working policy. And like any other healthy policy, it would be advisable that you would be reviewing this at intervals. So in terms of remote or hybrid or flexible working, what are we talking about? Well, hybrid working falls under the banner of remote working. And this is in connection with the government's remote working scheme and how they see remote working, or how they describe it. And it can sometimes also be referred to as e-working or flexible working. So any of those monikers would be appropriate in the remote working general classification. So a hybrid working model is when an employee works part of their time in the workplace, the traditional arrangement, and then part of their work time either from home or anywhere else other than the traditional workspace. Now, in looking at a recent Accenture Future of Work study, it was interesting for me that one of the key outputs of asking people about where they work, how they feel about it, asking employer organizations the same question. One of the things that emerged was that asking where people should work in the future might be the wrong question. And maybe a better question is, what unleashes a person's potential, enabling them to be healthy, productive, regardless of where they work? And in asking that question, the respondents in this Accenture Future of Work study, 63% of high growth organizations had enabled productivity anywhere as a workforce model. So they weren't stuck with the traditional model. And 69% of negative or no growth companies were very stuck with the physical traditional workspace. Now, that's just one lens, but I think it's an important one to bring into what is a future ways of working webinar. And just in, I suppose, growing that, if we look at some case studies, and we can certainly all relate to this one because we know the entity, which is Bank of Ireland. So if we look at their Chief People's Officer, Matt Elliott, people have got confidence now that they will be judged on the output of their work, not on the input of it. And I think that's a crucial distinction, and one that culturally we knew we needed to change. That is good for merit-based outcomes for colleagues when it comes to their career progression. And he was speaking to the CIPD, which is the professional body for personnel in Ireland. And he was advising that currently, with more than 3/4 of their 3,500 staff wanting to work at home between 25 and 75% of the working week, Bank of Ireland have committed to supporting flexible working. So the physical workspace still remains, and there are still big differences that they have paralleled alongside that. This is this hybrid working model. So they now have a network of 11 remote working hubs where employees are able to carry out their work, where they book a desk and they can work remotely, flexibly, hybridly there, and they can also work per their local agreement in their traditional workspace. Briefly then, another example I came across was Global Giving UK, and their plan was to invite staff. Now, they were small, but again, this could register with some of your smaller members. 16 staff members were invited to use a variety of shared office spaces across the UK, allowing staff to meet face-to-face while enjoying a shorter commute. The only requirement was for everyone to come into a central hub once a month for a whole team meeting. The pay-as-they-go spaces allowed the company, who previously had to rent central London head office space, to save money while giving staff the flexibility to book into a physical space whenever they felt the need. So just some insights there into real businesses that are engaging around flexible and hybrid working models. Now, I did touch at the beginning and say that with change, obviously, comes some different outcomes. So if we look at some of the pros and cons, it's been identified that some of the pros would be more flexibility, contributing to this better work-life balance. And no doubt that is a strong theme that has emerged for everybody on the island of Ireland as a consequence of COVID itself. There can be some revenue tax relief. I don't think that has been very attractive to date for employees, but it looks like there might be some work being done on that. That may be a feature for some, it may not. In any event, it's a change. I think certainly an issue that has gotten on to the main agenda is the environment. And there certainly are many people who are endorsing the reduced carbon footprint in terms of their ability to work remotely. On the less attractive side, maybe less collaboration can negatively impact on innovation. And that's why you have, like in the previous slide, underpinning flexibility with regular meetups of everybody, perhaps to combat that. It is definitely a concern that employees, if they are working maybe entirely remotely, or a lot of their time remotely, does that add to isolation? And does that affect their well-being? There are definitely tools and skills that need to be provided for line managers in relation to performance management of a remote or a hybrid working workforce. Another, I suppose, challenge, and it's not, doesn't mean it can't be overcome, but is maintaining the culture of your entity. That was easy to do inside 4 kind of hermetically sealed walls, but you lose some of that when people are not in the space as frequently. Inclusivity may become an issue for some. Obviously, that's probably individually based. Different coping levels. You would have had that in the physical traditional workspace, but maybe it's more difficult to be alert to somebody's coping levels. And obviously that's going to depend on their income. It's going to depend on their living situation, the stage of career that they're at. It's a view that virtual networking can be very difficult. You know, respectfully, Zoom can do lots of great things, but there are many things it can't do. People refer to that water cooler space, and that they say that that's what's missing in terms of remote working. And then when you talk to certainly people who've come in either as a graduate or as a new employee in an organization, learning opportunities, they need to be addressed, because the traditional learning opportunities, if you're running a remote or a hybrid workspace, they're not capturing the learning requirements fully of people. And you're looking, obviously, when you take in people, that they will stay and progress. But then on the other side of that, it is without a doubt that the opportunity to work remotely and flexibly has opened up the talent pool in terms of recruitment. Remote job postings on LinkedIn have increased more than 5 times during the pandemic. So remote and hybrid working is appealing to the entity that we want to appeal to, the potential employee. We just need to work out the management of that, and that obviously requires some maybe different approaches. So what information should be included in your hybrid or remote working policy? Well, obviously, you know, you need to look at, are there roles within the organization that mightn't be suitable for remote working? Will employees need to follow a hybrid working schedule? Are there certain tasks which you as an employer would prefer to be taken care of in the office rather than at home? Or indeed vice versa, maybe that's how you'll schedule how remote working happens. While working remotely, is the employee allowed to work anywhere, or are there limitations? So could they go down to the local cafe and plug in their laptop? What hours should an employee be working? Are there set hours? Are you ensuring that, and possibly you did this very well during COVID, that the Organisation of Working Time Act is being observed if somebody is working remotely? The policy should also include details of how staff will be managed and supported in terms of their remote working. So how do you expect your workforce to communicate with you, their manager, and indeed their colleagues? And what do you need to do to ensure that they can effectively communicate? So have you got Teams? Have you got Zoom? Is there sufficient internet connectivity? How are you going to onboard new staff? How will you performance manage these employees in their remote or hybrid working environments? And obviously one, again, that we have featured in the pandemic, how do we review and ensure our duty of care in relation to the health, safety and well-being of remote working employees is maintained? So the guidelines in relation to the policy obviously should be clearly defined, and that would also need us to determine what equipment is suitable for remote working and how are we going to provide that equipment. We need to review perhaps insurance requirements. So have we to tell our insurers that people are working at a particular nominated location, or indeed at their home or at any location in terms of what you introduce in your remote working policy. What about the remote location risk assessment? And I'm talking in terms of the ergonomics in particular. And how do you ascertain that your integrity in terms of cybersecurity will be maintained? So these are just questions that we need to be thinking about to populate our hybrid working policy. You obviously will have to reflect in your policy any public health advice. So I think there is a mood out there, and it's great that maybe COVID is receding, and I hope that we're correct about that. But unfortunately, the nature of the beast so far has been that we've thought that a couple of times and it's come back. So public health advice, I think, is going to be a feature, certainly in the medium term. You're probably looking at what your competitors are doing. It is really important to take on board the sentiment of your workforce. You obviously have to tick boxes in terms of regulatory and other compliance. You need to ensure that you update your policies. And a big one is providing training to supervisors and managers who are expected to deliver those asks in what is a very different workspace to the traditional one that they perhaps had originally worked in. Okay, and maybe when you're thinking about your hybrid policy, you want to think about, you know, things like emphasizing the culture of trust, because that is clearly something that you have to engage around if you're going to be successful in respect of any remote kind of working. We had oversight in the traditional model, and I'm not suggesting it was Dickensian and people were walking around barking orders at their staff, far from it, but there still was a presence there. And when somebody's working remotely, there isn't that oversight. And so that really moves people into believing and engaging and acting in a way like they support each other and that they trust each other. In terms of the proximity, you know, we need to be aware as leaders that we don't have that ability to shout across somebody in terms of, oh, can you give me a hand with this, in the way that we might have, maybe worked out solutions collaboratively in an open plan office. So we need to think about that in terms of how we're going to move maybe projects forward, and maybe you have to schedule them. So maybe scheduling is becoming a bigger issue. Obviously evolving management and leadership styles, I've touched on that. And then the human moments are that precise thing. They are the water cooler. So, you know, if you had events that happen spontaneously, like for example, we had our first birthday cake in the office in 2 years about 3 weeks ago. And clearly that's not something that you're able to do in terms of a remote environment, but maybe you're able to schedule something that mirrors that notifies the person that everybody knows that it's their birthday and you're wishing them well. So we do have to think about what were spontaneous facilities that helped us to bond as a workforce. They're not there if there is a facility for remote and hybrid working. They're not there in the same capacity, at least. So the return to work transition protocol then. This is the most recent and present provisions that the government have scheduled in relation to individuals returning to work after the lifting of restrictions. So they've described it as the transitional protocol. And since the 24th of January, this has enabled workers who weren't in the workplace during the pandemic to return on a phased basis. So you can see that the key measures there, that there needs to be an update to the business and safety plan. So you need to go back and check that you are compliant in relation to your COVID response plan, your occupational health and safety risk assessment, and your safety statement, because maybe you've changed how you do things since the last iteration. Obviously, dealing with the ongoing suspected cases of COVID in the workplace, and how you're going to respond to those, ensuring, and this was in the previous protocols, that you have your lead worker representative and that they are making sure that there are the appropriate safety measures in situ for the transitional period. And then in relation to COVID testing, that we are still aware that this is a circumstance where individuals determine whether they want to disclose their vaccination status or not. It is still a matter for the individual, so it's important that the employer remembers that. In relation to the well-being measures, I suppose really this graphic, I hope, captures the key things that we need to bring to bear in our transitional workspaces. This wheel is including resilience, performance, and engagement, and they would combine in terms of workplace well-being. So what we need from the organization is a positive culture and an energizing environment. What we need in terms of the worker is that they are going to have job satisfaction and that they have this much hankered for work-life balance. And then that we have this resilience in terms of we being aware of how our team is doing, because we've built strong working relationships and we have highly effective managers who are tuned in this new space to how their team is doing. And that brings me then to some of the important employment law updates. So the first one is one that has been around since April 2021, but is very important in terms of moving into any form of remote working or hybrid working, because sometimes it gets forgotten in that space. So this is the code of practice on the right to disconnect. And distilling it right down to 3 simple elements, this code of practice has entitled employees since April 2021 to work in a way whereby they are not routinely obligated to perform work outside of their normal working hours. I touched earlier on the bill in relation to remote working and anti-penalization clauses. The same applies in relation to the right to disconnect. And in relation to the right to disconnect specifically, because an awful lot of our world is by email and other ways of electronic communication, the code of practice specifically highlights the right to disconnect in respect of calls and our emails after hours. So many organizations have, I think, added into their email as a matter of course that there is no obligation. Should you receive this email after ordinary working hours, you are not expected to respond to it outside of normal working hours. One warning there though, having that and acting contrary to it would be very problematic as far as the WRC would be concerned in terms of actualizing the right to disconnect for your workforce. So the point about it is that you need to, if that isn't the culture, but if that's what's being written, it's a little bit like saying we're an equal opportunities employer, and then we find that, you know, there are discriminatory attitudes towards maybe certain types of applicants for work. If we state on it that we are respecting people's right to disconnect, and then culturally or actually that's not the way the organization works, then that's problematic. And it's very problematic for it to be normalized by senior staff in the organization, because then effectively that says to junior staff, well, actually, we say this, but we expect you to be taking emails at 7, 8, 9 o'clock in the evening. The next one is the new statutory sick pay bill. So at this point in time in Ireland, other than you having a contractual commitment to pay somebody for sickness absence, there is no statutory obligation for an employer to pay sick pay. This is contemplated to change this year. It was contemplated to change in January, but the legislation hasn't been finalised yet. But the scheme of how this will work has been determined. So from a date yet to be determined this year, and one would expect it in the first quarter, definitely in the second quarter of the year, 3 days certified sick absence will be payable by an employer. And then incrementally, 5 days in 23, 7 days in 2024, and 10 days in 25. Now, in order for a worker to qualify for this, they will have to have a minimum of 13 weeks service, and they will also have to furnish a medical certificate to confirm their sickness. So we are awaiting the introduction of the 3-day period at the moment. So that's something just to be watching for. Other legislation that is imminent is the Transparent and Predictable Working Conditions legislation. So this is due to be introduced on the 1st of August this year to implement the EU's directive on transparent and predictable working conditions. So this directive requires that member states ensure that staff probation periods typically last no longer than 6 months, subject to certain limited exceptions. So possibly in your own individual employments at the moment, you're operating probationary periods. Many people operate them from the start date for 6 months, but some organizations have a probationary period that might be 9 months or 10 months. And this directive is essentially changing that and saying that other than in exceptional circumstances, 6 months will be the threshold in terms of a probationary period. We're awaiting the act on that, but as it is a directive, the generality of that directive will have to be reproduced in the act, and it will have to be on the statute books by August. So maybe you want to look in terms of your recruitment and selection, and you want to start changing your probationary period, if it's relevant to you, to 6 months. Another important imminent development is the Protected Disclosures Amendment Bill. Now this broadens, so we have the whistleblowing legislation since 2014, but this bill broadens the definition of a worker. So the descriptor of shareholder, volunteer, unpaid trainee, member of the administrative or management or supervisory body, or non-executive members, and people who acquire information on what they maintain as irrelevant wrongdoing during their pre-contract engagement or recruitment process with you, they will be captured now by the Protected Disclosures Act. So up until this bill, they were not included or recognised as people who could seek protection under the Protected Disclosures, or if you prefer, whistleblowing legislation. And this amending bill obliges all employers, including private sector organisations with 50 or more employees, to have procedures for employees to make protected disclosures as of the 17th of December 2023. So as of December 23, if your entity has 50 or more employees and you're in the private sector, then the protected disclosures legislation is applicable to you. Another update, the Parental Leave Act's update. So the 2019 Act provided the right for parents to take paid leave from work during the first year of a child's life. In 2021, the provisions were extended to provide parents with 5 weeks of paid leave during the first 2 years of the child's life. It was announced in the budget 2022 that this would be extended to provide parents with 7 weeks of parents' leave, and this is expected to come into effect in July 2022. And then just in the couple of minutes that we have left, the work-life balance bill. So this bill will transpose again another EU directive focusing on work-life balance for parents and carers. And again, the Irish state have until August 2022 to implement this bill. Now, the objective of the directive is to increase the participation of women in the labour market, and also there's very poor uptake of family-related leave and family-related flexible working arrangements. So that's the objective of the directive. And it was notified some weeks ago that the legislature are also going to include provisions in this bill for domestic violence leave, because obviously that became a feature in terms of the incidences of this, particularly during COVID, unfortunately. So they're all ones to be watching out for. I would imagine the first one to drop will be the statutory sick pay, and obviously that is going to affect everybody across the board. So just be watchful of that, and indeed you can always link in with our Linea service around that. So your takeaways from this morning's session: prepare your remote working policy, be aware of the current protocol, and I'm sure you're always aware of your employee well-being, but obviously the new ways of working require us to be perhaps more tuned in that regard, and also to have on the radar the upcoming employment law developments. And as I say, the first of those I would expect to be the Statutory Sick Pay Act and the inception of that. So thank you very much for your company this morning. I hope that you have found the session helpful. We have a partnership program, as I indicated, and we're happy to provide advices, representation, guidance and support to peoples across private, not-for-profit and public sector. And we also have an offering that goes by the way of Linea, which is a wonderful accessible facility with all of the up-to-date information and instant access for people who need to know things in respect of HR responsibilities or IR responsibilities. And we also provide training and ergonomics assessment if that's something that your business requires at this point, or indeed at any stage into the future. Can I thank you for having me this morning, and I wish you well as you continue in this first quarter. I hope business is back. Certainly seems like people are out and about more. I hope you're getting some of that pent up savings that people have amassed. I suppose there has to be some silver linings in what's been an awful period globally. But we go forward, and we go forward particularly in the world of work with awareness in terms of these important developments, and preparing for what will be imminently a new way of working, whether you're going to go with a fully remote or indeed some form of hybrid or flexible working.